Let me begin directly by reminding you quickly the most important names I mentioned at the end of last week's class. We discussed at some length the work of Carpini and Rubruck, two famous early travelers to Asia, focusing on how they brought new knowledge of Asia to Europe, creating a series of new tropes while also recycling some of the long established visions Europeans had about the remote East. There were also other names that we discussed a little about, like André de Longjumeau, for instance, but let's move on. The covers of Intorceta's translations that were published in his lifetime. The general title of these translations was this dedicated to the political and moral science of the Chinese, the Sapientia Sinica, or the Sinarum Scientia. Basically, what is exciting is, again, the visual outlook, the way that knowledge is combined on the pages of the book. Because what we have here is the translated text that is, notice, very much disciplined. So we have it paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. We have the Latin translation, and then we have the Chinese text with pronunciation next to them, right? So this would be the beginning, the famous beginning of the Dongyong, right? As you can see over here. This way of combining Chinese knowledge with European languages or European language, the European language of science, Latin in particular, is going to create, well, is very, very typical for the early days of sinology. What is even more interesting is that these texts produced in Latin, quite a few of them acquired, not long after their publication, vernacular translations. So we have a translation into French, and this particular translation would be also, or some of these translations would be rendered from French into other languages, like into English, and so on and so forth. So what happens is that we have one general Latin language initial version that itself gets adopted into for wider readership into various local European languages. Again, what we have here is a more European style kind of page. So this looks Chinese, at least on its right hand side, right? So we have the Chinese text in columns with the European text disciplined a la européenne, in the European manner, but on the left hand side. So we have two different a two-part division of the page, while here we have the text written in the European fashion with Chinese text interspersed with Latin text, and so on and so forth. This is from the Taxue, from the Great Learning. Finally, time for Verbist. Verbist was a scholar whose scientific output was quite large. This is just a selection of his many texts. From among here, we have in red the things that I take to be the most important for our discussion. On the one hand, we have this text in Chinese, which was written for a Chinese audience, Essential Records of the Western Part Submitted for Imperial Review. So it's basically a text about the world, a kind of short encyclopedia, if you would. This is a map coming up in the already long history of Jesuit maps of China, and this is a text that was produced in Europe, dedicated to what appears here to be as the Tartar grammar, that is the grammar of the Manchu language. This was published in an anthology text edited quite a few years after it was initially written in 1696, but it was at least published. Now, I will skip quickly images from his various other scientific texts. Again, I have selected them for your enjoyment mostly, and also because they Verbist represented a great deal of astronomical instruments actually produced and used by the Jesuits at the Chinese court in Beijing. Some of them can still be found there. They look like that. They were complicated instruments meant to calculate all sorts of things. The importance of astronomy for establishing the imperial calendar and hence the religious calendar was very, very significant. So the Jesuits are able to produce more accurate calculations and therefore occupied at some points highly prestigious positions at the Chinese court. Various instruments used for these purposes. This is dedicated to eclipses, and we can see here the text written both in Chinese, both in Latin, in Chinese, and in Manchu. So we have here a trilingual text. Notice how this looks. Pretty exciting, I would say, visually at least, plus the representation of the eclipse or whatever is happening during an eclipse. And this image of the Jesuit observatory in Beijing that can still be visited. Well, I think it's been reconstructed, but I forgot. But basically, this image was widely admired by Europeans and was going to be present in other texts in the century as well. Now, all these come from the encyclopedia, the short encyclopedia produced by Verbist for imperial perusal, for imperial review. Now, the text ends, so we have the text, and unlike other Jesuit productions, we don't have images included next to Chinese characters on the page. What we have is that we have the text, and at the end, we have a kind of appendix, which includes just images. Notice here that what we have is primarily images of weird, strange animals, weird, strange things. Now, it begins somewhat mildly with this, which doesn't look like very weird to me. And then we have, guess what? Take a look. Our favorite animal in this class, or one of our favorite animals in this class, the unicorn. Just in case the Chinese didn't know about it yet. As you will see, they actually did. And then we have, well, mermaids. Ariel, or whatever her name is, was next to a whale, okay? So they come one after another. And finally, my favorite animal on the list, the giraffe. Now, you are going to ask, why exactly is it that this has managed to become my favorite animal? And here we are going to go on a tangent. I shouldn't really go on this tangent because it's going to take another very valuable 5 minutes of this class, but I can't help it. And the reason is that I was curious about the giraffe as represented by Verbist. So I started finding images of giraffes, and then I started finding out a great deal about the history of giraffe representations in China. That started significantly around the beginning of the 15th century, around the time when the Yongle Emperor received as a tribute from India or Asia or Africa or wherever, a giraffe. Now this giraffe stunned people, and it got represented by one major painter, and countless copies, not quite countless, but many, many copies were made after this particular representation. We have another one, so we have 2 or 3 representations of the giraffe. The reasons for all this being the fact that it was considered an auspicious animal. It was in fact considered to be a qilin, itself a kind of auspicious animal, signifying the fact that the universe is happy with Jungler's coup d'etat, because basically he got power, as you know, by doing very, very bad things to his own family. So what we have here is a series of giraffe representations, many of them copies of the same original or copies after copies, and they all differ in small manners one from another. This is the one at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and then we have one image after one image after one image. Take a look at how this guy looks, how this guy looks, and how this guy looks. They are not quite the same. One of them is in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. This one over here. And then we have yet another giraffe, and yet another giraffe, and yet another giraffe. All these giraffes were... It is known under the title of, on the internet, by a guy who turns out to be particularly obsessed with giraffes, among other things. I shared his obsession, so I was very happy that he had started collecting them a bit earlier than myself. I'm not sure exactly why he likes them so much, and well, I'm not sure why I like them so much. But the problem here is that he doesn't really give the source of some of his representations, so I don't really know, in quite a few cases, where exactly these can be found. Many of them, in fact, are circulate, so they are sold, they're in private hands. This one is not, and it's obviously a different representation of the same giraffe. This one is to be found in a museum in Chicago, and it went from private hands to a museum quite a long time ago. Finally, we have this, which is a bit more, which reverts, notice the exact positioning of the man and the giraffe. So here we have right-hand side man, left-hand side giraffe. Now we have this the other way round. We have it reversed. The individual doesn't look at the giraffe, and the giraffe is not looking at him. Now here they are kind of, engaged in a dialogue. Here they hate each other, probably after being represented over and over again. And finally, we have this particular giraffe in this particularly interesting text, which is unique. We have just this one copy of this text from Ming Times. It's now available in England, and it's been digitized. You can find it on the internet. Produced in China in Ming Times that includes this image as well. Now this is, I think, the very last image of the giraffe that I collected for today. This was the tangent I engaged on. I kind of tried to stop, but I did, like scholars analyze them, they classify them, they try to do the genealogy of which is a copy of which. It's kind of interesting. I think there are giraffe fans, unacknowledged giraffe fans. Now I call myself one. Notice the title. Yeah, so this is a map. This is an image of a qilin. This is exactly what we have over here, right? The auspicious animal. This particular text over here has been translated by the crazy collector of giraffe images on the internet, so you can find them there for your enjoyment, explaining why this is auspicious, etc., etc., etc. Time to stop and move on to Verbeest and going back to his strange objects, right? So we are once again in the visual appendix of this text, and here he moves away from images of animals. We have a representation of a ship, and finally he moves to representing various European constructions, the most exciting of which are the seven wonders of the ancient world. This would be the Colossus of Rhodes, and this would be the Colosseum in Rome, right? This is not really one of the wonders of the world, but it was represented there just in case. Now, this belongs to the larger visual production of Verbeest, who also produced this map in the tradition of Ricci that we have talked about and that we know a great deal of. This is a fascinating map. It's got its own long history that we don't really have time to discuss. This is for your enjoyment in case you feel like reading the text over here. All these maps are again, this is not, I cannot tell you all the things I would like to tell you, but basically maps, once again, are not simple objects that we skip through, right? They tell many, many stories about their makers, about their agendas, about their dreams, about their wishes, about their desire. We are sometimes surprised by the differences in the manuscripts. There are, notice, combinations of images and words, right? They classify, they objectify, etc., etc., etc. Notice that at the bottom on this particular exemplar we have mostly text, but here we start having other things, and these other things are animals. This is a black and white poor quality representation. Notice that we have the turkey over here, we are somewhere in the Americas here, but then we are on more familiar territory, and guess what we have here? I guess you can see it. I guess it's a giraffe. And guess what we have here? Oops, it's a unicorn. You can see these better, the giraffe and the unicorn next to other animals, more familiar ones. And this is the giraffe next to its text. The text has been translated, all the text on the map has been translated. There is a site specifically dedicated to the map. And this scholarly translation explains exactly why the giraffe looks away from the guy in those copies we discussed at the end. When a person looks upon it, the giraffe will calmly turn around as if to show off its splendid nature. I'm so beautiful, look at me. Giraffe, the giraffe said. This would be the explanation over here. I confess to not having found this particular translation, this particular site immediately, and having spent quite a few enjoyable moments with my daughter trying to figure out the exact text, because the exact words like Ethiopia here, right, are kind of difficult to figure out at first, right? But it's easily legible and kind of fun. Anyways, finally we have the unicorn, which would be located in India. Over here we do have some information on the poisonous qualities or how the horn of the unicorn is used in order to fight poison. This is kind of connects a bit back to European knowledge. We have here different images of the same. Unfortunately, this is not legible. It's found somewhere in Australia in a library, but notice the beautiful blue giraffe, in case you are wondering. This is the giraffe in its blue period, Picasso style. This is a Korean copy of the same, where the blue is kind of less visible. We are moving towards a very fanciful leopard-like spotted unicorn over here. Now the unicorn looks even more fanciful in a kind of really weird color combination on this particular copy. Now this becomes weirder and weirder. They had no idea what they were talking about. They had no idea how these animals look like. Finally, we have the sirens or the mermaids described over here. A fellow prisoner, and the top half of its body looks like a man or a woman, while the bottom looks like the tail of a fish. Its bones can be used to treat blood illnesses, in case you're wondering. And the female siren can imitate many different sounds, as Odysseus's friends figured out by themselves quite quickly, and as well as many other people in the Greek myth. Finally, the opossum, located somewhere in Chile and looking very, very strange. Now, all these belong on that map that was produced over and over and reproduced over and over in China, and not only, as you noticed, in East Asia, many years after the beast first made it. We are moving to the next slide. The names included here are mostly French for reasons that have to do with Louis XIV and his dialogue from afar with the Chinese Empire and the state sponsoring of the Jesuit mission. I'm not going to talk to you about all this because it's too complicated and long. Suffice it to remember that Philippe Couplet, a name we found on the previous name slide as well, together with Louis Lecomte and Bouvet, are among the most important sinologists and producers of knowledge about China at the end of the century. On the list we have also a Portuguese father. Now, Couplet is very, very important in our discussion because he put together, with a long and very important introduction, all the translations of the classics, of the Chinese classics, produced by earlier fathers like Intorcheta and several others. This appeared in a very important and significant edition known as Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, or the Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. This was translated into French in abbreviated form. It has been translated into English, I think. It was translated a few years ago. So we have it in English, I think, for full perusal. It's very, very interesting. It's a very, very interesting document. It is a text that positions Confucius very, very highly. Also makes Confucianism religiously very, very compatible with Christianity. There's a lot to discuss about this, but we certainly do not have time. Suffice it to say that this was a highly influential text in the creation of the image of China as a open to Christianity and also philosophical land that the 18th century will inherit. I will skip the text on, or the information on Magalhães. The text appeared, he was Portuguese, but the text appeared in French, and then it was translated into English. And I will mention then the text of Louis Lecomte. To me, this sounds like a weak argument in many, many senses. At the very end of the century, a text known as Nouveaux Mémoires sur l'état présent de la Chine, Memoirs and Observations, this is the English translation, made in a late journey through the Empire of China. This was an amazingly significant text. It shaped, probably more than many other earlier texts, the ideas that Europeans kept. He talks about the brothel quarter in Peking and where it was located. Next century. We'll discuss about this text at some length next week. But please do remember that together with Couplet and Bouvet, Lecomte represents one of the members of the one of the most influential members of the French Jesuits at the end of the century. Today, I will just emphasize the visual component of both this and this text produced by Bouvet, which is dedicated to a kind of anthropological, short anthropology of China. Before that, take a look at this. This was on the frontispiece of the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, and this particular representation of Confucius as a sage, kind of dominating with his person China and its knowledge, stuck to European image of China for quite a while. This is the cover of the Magalhães text, and we should stop here because I think it's break time as we will approach discussing Leconte's visual parts, the visual parts in Leconte's text. So please have your break.
Excuse me. Is the online forum one still open to be submitted?
No. So there's going to be a new forum coming up.
All right.
Probably very soon.
The system
Who could be put to good service, right? So I'm not closing it.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that, but basically I won't consider contributions there.
Okay. Okay, sure.
Yes?
This one.
Yeah.
I've sent you email about my attendance.
Yeah, so you are, please remind me, I don't remember. What was the problem?
I have an intern in China, so I just come back.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I didn't take the test.
Oh, you did not?
Yes. So can I do anything to for my?
Well, yes, you can. Let's discuss about this. I'll figure something out. Write an email to me again.
Okay.
Yeah, telling me about your situation, then I'll figure something out for you, right? You cannot take the test. I'll ask you to do some supplementary work or something along these lines. But do write to me so that I have the message there and it doesn't skip my mind. So the moment I receive your email, I'll reply and we'll figure something out. Do you have my email?
Oh yes.
Yes. Okay.
I've sent you email.
Send it again, or just tell me. Okay, we discussed today. I'm the student who had the scholarship in China. Please send me some work to do, okay? Just so that I have your address over there, yeah? In the inbox.
And I want to know,
Yes?
when is the next test?
Test. Well, do you have access to Moodle? You do?
Yeah, I have.
Well, the syllabus is there. So take a look at the syllabus, because I don't really know. Why? What's your problem? What?
I can say syllabus first.
Okay.
I think I saw syllabus, but I don't see any specific.
Yes, there is, right? So if you take a look at the syllabus, you'll notice that the tests are emphasized, are highlighted in gray, right?
Okay.
So take a look.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the test we took 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Are we going to get it back for like reference?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So when are we getting it back?
Well, next week. Weren't you here when I started explaining?
I was a bit late.
So basically, I have your results. What I don't have is I didn't put in the grades on a sheet of paper in a table, right? So you will get them back with the results. I made a few general comments on all of them at the beginning, but you will get them next week, right? So the general comments regarded the various problems that appeared and that quite a few of you shared. I'm not sure if this applies to you or not, but the results are in. Mostly some of them are very good, some of them are very bad. Mostly they're average, right? 12, 14 or so out of 20. And this is the general average. So I don't know exactly your case, but.
Thank you.
which is in French.
But the same way.
What? Any problems? Marco Polo. Everybody. These are the only images or the most important images you can find in Leconte's book that give us information about a China that is dedicated to knowledge, that is militarily powerful and respectable, that is cultivated, that includes, for no clear reason, to travel to China. When I say for no clear reason, I have in mind the fact that Christian fold, right? So if we analyze the exact images that, or what exactly gets represented, we also understand how such visual agendas can be read in relation to the texts they belong to. This is an analysis of the present state of China with very, very beautiful images. This is by Bouvet. Very, very beautiful images, again themselves worthy of being analyzed. What exactly gets represented? Not only how it gets represented, but what gets represented. Notice that this would be a military official, while this would be a civil official. So a military person, a administrative person, both of them one next to another, actually not one next to another, but one image after another. Then the ladies, Chinese ladies. This would be Manchu women, represented separately from the Chinese ladies. The Manchu men, a prince here, and that would be an official. So notice that in European texts at the time, that talk about the Manchurian Qing dynasty control of Chinese territory, the Chinese and the Manchu are represented in keeping with realities as belonging to two different layers, two different areas, two different places, and so on and so forth. Now, this is just a selection. There are much many more images worth discussing, but we are now skipping to a very exciting topic that fascinated European minds at that time, and that I will need to sum up as quickly as possible, and in relation to which China will ultimately turn important as well. The topic is the universal language. The idea that a universal language has either existed or can exist again. A universal language allowing people from all over the world to communicate, like in the times before God decided to punish humans and put down the Tower of Babel that foolish people decided to build in order to challenge God. This is a very famous episode in the Bible. It appears not far away from the very beginning of the sacred text, and you know the story quite well. If you don't know it, I'm sure you know this famous representation of the Tower of Babel. Basically, before this episode in the history of mankind, according to the Bible, humans spoke one single language. It was the language of who has foreign kings or foreign leaders killed by his loyal assassins. This very horrible moment in history when humans decided to challenge God and decided to build this building, and God himself decided to punish them by tearing down their tower and by making their language many, into many, right? The multiplication of human languages. right? This is the biblical explanation of the reasons why humans speak so many languages. So of course, this project involves either discovering this primitive, early, God inspired human language, or on a different dimension, creating one. Why all this was happening at that particular time? There are many, many reasons. The most important one being listed here. Most important ones being listed here. After 1492, when America was discovered, in time, but we can also say a bit earlier, probably at the beginning of the 15th century, the world was becoming a much larger place. And Europeans were learning a great deal of many other things they had no idea about. Becoming a much larger place, Europeans were confronted with many new languages, many new idioms, many new cultures, many things that challenged the traditional biblical inspired understanding of human culture. Then Europeans tried to make sense of all this, and because the Bible was produced by God, it's a sacred text that cannot be contradicted, the new realities discovered had to be made fit into, well, the biblical story. So the new realities had to be domesticated in keeping with the European understanding of the world. Another thing that is important. Religiously, the Europeans were confronted with all sorts of different peoples. Some of these people seemed ripe for conversion, seemed to be easily it seemed to Europeans that they could easily make them into Christians. Accordingly, it was believed that this might have something to do with a kind of primitive natural ability of humans to acknowledge the truths of Christian religions without being Christian. This would happen because of their ability to kind of have a memory of a primitive language or of a primitive culture that the Europeans, the Christian Europeans, felt it was their duty to rediscover, find. Many, many other similar images are included. It's happening at a time when the European idioms themselves were multiplying, culturally speaking. That is, languages like English and French and Spanish and Portuguese were becoming more and more and more and more languages of culture, replacing slowly but steadily Latin as the one unifying language of a shared European cultural heritage. To put it otherwise, this made Europeans sensitive to linguistic issues. And linguistics in the 16th and 17th century, but in the 16th century in particular, is an absolutely fascinating endeavor. This is the beginning of many, many studies in Europe of non-European languages. Here we have the first Arabists, for instance, people studying Arabic. People studying Hebrew. This already had like a long history, but now this is becoming more scientific, and so on and so forth. The first grammars, the first dictionaries. It's a long story, but to simplify things, late Renaissance linguistic conscience is strong, very, very strong. All this against this background of changes that was happening. Finally, or almost finally, again in late Renaissance, we are in a period when religious texts and texts in general are read more freely. There is more room for interpretation, and people like, for instance, like Erasmus of Rotterdam works on texts, getting involved in what is known as textual criticism, comparing manuscripts, putting linguistic data together. Again, all strongly supports investigations cultural, linguistic, or otherwise, of languages at large. Last but not least, at the end of the period we are talking about, in the 16th century, Europe is filled with war. There's a lot of war happening there, religious wars. The political system is challenged. Generally, it is room, it seems, it is time, it seemed to many Europeans, to rearrange knowledge. And indeed, knowledge will be rearranged soon. The received knowledge of the Middle Ages, so to say. Now, against this background, we have the very first texts that contribute to the topic of the universal language. We can skip here the names, except perhaps that of Bishop Ussher, who in the 1650s produced the text, among many others, that was going to be the most important in calculating the beginnings of the world. Why would that be such an important thing? Why would Europeans become obsessed with finding out exactly when the world was produced? Well, because the Bible does contain a historical account of things. It's got like Liber Peregrinationis, span of various characters who lived how many years or hundreds of years. We know of Methuselah, who lived like 900 years or so. So people in the 17th century tried to find out, going from the present moment back in time, as to when exactly the world was created and what was the exact historical succession of the creation of the world. Now, many people became interested in this kind of biblical chronology for reasons we will see on the next slide. But before we do that, let us notice that Bishop Ussher, good Bishop Ussher, decided that the world itself, that God created the world on the nightfall preceding Sunday, October the 23rd, in the year 4004 BC. Okay? Unfortunately, he doesn't give the exact moment, like, 7:45 or whatever, p.m., but basically this kind of tells us the kind of intellectual adventure, the kind of intellectual quests that people in the 17th century were interested in making. To us, this may seem like a ridiculous endeavor, but do notice that the Bible represented, or still represented, the absolute sacred text that gave a vision of the world as it is, and that could not be challenged. Now, who was challenging it? These were challenging it. People like Martino Martini wrote, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, a text on Chinese history, large-scale text on Chinese history, that basically introduced Chinese historical knowledge to European audiences. It was written by a Jesuit father, so it couldn't be a lie. But the problem is that such a text seemed, through the very antiquity of the names it mentioned, so such a text seemed to challenge the biblical narrative. How could the Chinese be so old? That was a problem, as you already know. And how could they not be mentioned in the Bible at all if they are so old? That tantalized and challenged European minds. On the one hand, the Bible couldn't be contradicted. On the other hand, we have the Chinese, and they are old, and the Bible doesn't talk about them. We need to address this issue. We need to make the biblical chronology clear, and hence Bishop Ussher and his fanciful creation of the world. And we also need to plot Chinese history against the biblical chronology to try to match them. Such matching happens in a number of important texts here by Dutch scholars like Vossius and Horn, by Kircher, whose name I already mentioned, I will mention again, and mostly by John Webb. John Webb, who wrote a beautiful text, we'll talk about it in a short while, an historical essay endeavoring the probability that the language of the Empire of China is the primitive language. To put it otherwise, that Adam and Eve saw each other and said, Ni hao. Now, all this involved, before we even address this issue, matching chronologies. So finding biblical characters and identifying them with characters mentioned in the Chinese chronicles. And here we have a few examples that may look to us like completely out of control, but were taken very, very seriously by people of the time. For example, the Chinese histories mentioned the Emperor Fuxi. Now, who is this guy? Well, of course, it's Adam himself. It's just that, you know, the Chinese couldn't pronounce the word Adam because, you know, they lost it. So they just called him Fuxi. Nah, said another guy. It's not Adam. It must be Noah's son. Like one of the sons of Noah, known as Cam. No, again, said another one. It is Adam. But if this guy is Adam, then Nuwa must be Eve. Aha! And we can move on. Shenung would be Cain. And now is Noah, the guy with the flood. And so on and so forth. So what basically all these people who wrote significantly in dialogue, so they kind of contradicted each other and said, how can you say that Adam is Fuxi? No, Fuxi must be the other guy. All these people were debating such issues at some length. Notice that this continued to happen all the way, at least until the 1730s, when Christian Bayer was still writing about such issues. Fun or not, this is part of Europe's intellectual attempt at making sense of a different world, of a world that did not fit the Bible. Okay? It was outside the Bible. How can we explain it? Well, by doing this kind of stuff. I'm simplifying things here horribly. The story is much more complicated. There are different versions of the Bible. In some versions of the Bible, chronologies look different, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. It's long, it's complicated, it's lovely, it's crazy. It's part, again, of the European heritage, intellectual heritage. Against all this, finally, the actual quest for universal language, recovering it or inventing it. The list contains many, many, many names. Those in red tend to be more, or I find them more important. Mostly, we have here very respectable philosophers like Francis Bacon, educators like Comenius, and finally, very strange, interesting scholars like John Wilkins, who is trying to invent a philosophical language together with several other people in the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s to recreate to create a universal language. And finally, the text we are mostly interested in, John Webb's idea of Chinese being the original language spoken by people. So what we should all do is, obviously, if we want to communicate easily, is all of us learn Chinese and abandon our idioms. I'm not going to mention all these names. All of them are fascinating. All of them are interesting. Let's move on. I will skip the beautiful images dedicated to the Tower of Babel. It's interesting to notice when a great deal of such images were produced. Of course, we have earlier medieval examples like this, but quite a great many of them were produced at the end of the 16th century, at the time of this raise in linguistic consciousness I mentioned a bit earlier, blah, 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 blah. Finally, John Webb, two different Chinese translations of the title. You can find them here. Now, let's see exactly what this individual had to say. The story of John Webb itself is worth telling in some detail, but I certainly do not have time. He was an architect, etc. But basically, he just wrote this little essay trying to tell us, forget about anything else, Chinese is what you're looking for. Now, 75% of his book is primarily dedicated to demonstrating how characters in Chinese history match characters in the Bible, in the style I just mentioned with Fuxi and Adam and so on and so forth. The other 25% is dedicated, and this clearly shows how this combination of reality and imagination that Mandeville's text was understood. Humans given to humans by God. The very first argument he produces is the fact that Chinese is a natural language. To us, this may seem like a normal thing. Like, what do you mean a natural language? Well, for some scholars like Gorlius, I mentioned his name 2 weeks ago, but forget about him. They believe that it had been purposefully invented by people. So it was kind of a thing that was an artifice, was created it didn't develop naturally like all human languages. It was like a system put together by humans for specific purposes. Now, his very first point is that no, this is like a natural language, like every single language, and we notice that this, or we can testify to its being a natural language by the fact that it is a language that is really, really simple. It's really got very little grammar. The captions of the images are mostly in French, I'm afraid. Linguistic creature that humans would normally produce when left to their own devices, kind of thing. Now, what does this mean? It means that the older trope of Chinese having no grammar, having little rhetoric, as he says, or little logic, is revived. And here put to positive use. That's how we know it's natural, because naturally, I don't know, like Latin with its many cases, and I don't know, German with all these declensions or whatever, right? No. They would produce a language like Chinese. Simple, immediate, no grammar, everybody can learn it on the spot. He builds then his points by relying on a great many texts from the sinological literature of his time. He refers to very recent texts, and entered dialogue with scholars of his time at some length. Now, he suggests basically 6 criteria to check whether Chinese is the primitive language, universal language at all. So he discusses its generality, its modesty of expression, its utility, and its brevity. Next to this, he takes into account the scholarly arguments for each and every one of them. Now, we don't have really time to review all his arguments, but they are really funny. For example, simplicity. Yeah, so Chinese is a simple language. How are you going to demonstrate this? So again, guest students here who are studying Chinese, take heart. Look at what Webb is saying. So, how do we know Chinese is simple? Well, we know that it doesn't have all sorts of complicated flexionary forms. It doesn't have foreign words in it. It cannot really, express the foreign. It doesn't have the R sound, something that Europeans had noticed for a long time. And finally, my favorite argument runs like this. And as if all things conspired to prove this is the primitive tongue, we may observe how forcibly nature struggles to demonstrate so much. More specifically, the very first expression we make of life at the very instant minute of our birth is, as was touched on before, by uttering the Xinique word or the Chinese word ya. To put it otherwise, when the babies get born and they say wah, the very first cry, that's a Chinese word. Okay? So the very first human sound is Chinese. you misunderstand it if you think it's anything else. It is a Chinese word, particularly the Chinese word that he transcribes as ya, which we could probably pronounce as wa or something, I don't know. So basically that's how we know. Moreover, which is not only the first, but indeed the sole and only expression that mankind from nature can justly lay claim unto, because at that moment children are not part of any culture, right? So this is, you know, they speak their own given language, which would be Chinese. Then, I don't have time to explore them with you in detail, but take a... And in our infancy, the very first notions of speech we have are all monosyllables. As for instance, ta, hence covered in wool, not in feathers. Like happening in all other terms, with all these are of course Chinese words, or at least they are monosyllables, like, as we all know, it was believed at the time, all Chinese words were. This kind of arguments, together with many, many others, are finally put together into a long, into a complicated and wonderful, in fact, text dedicated to demonstrating exactly this. One thing that I also particularly like is the fact that in Chinese people don't swear. No? So don't say they don't have dirty words, they don't say bad things at all. So of course this must be the primitive language. Hebrew had been considered a candidate, but unfortunately Hebrew was known a bit better at that time, and people did notice that you can swear in Hebrew. It seemed that Europeans had no idea about how Chinese could contain bad words as well. Okay, and so on and so forth. I can warmly, and I will warmly recommend this text for your enjoyment. It is in English. It's not difficult to read. I think it's been translated into Chinese as well. It's a wonderful little text that makes perfect sense against the background it was produced. Against all this search for Europe, for the universal language. The search hasn't stopped, in case you are wondering, right? So languages have continued to be invented. Attempts at universal communication haven't died, but that's a different story, and it's not time for us to express it. But anyway, once again, let's take heart in the possibility of Chinese being the primitive language spoken by the very earliest forefathers, ancestors of humans. Time for Kircher, a text that I mentioned already, a person that I mentioned several times already, and his particular text known as China Monumentis or China Illustrata, a 1667 wonderful, wonderful, crazy collection of knowledge on China. Now, Kircher has been dubbed the last man who knew everything. Or one ill-intended individual might say who knew nothing. He was a scholar, a professor in Rome, a person who wrote many, many texts on a large variety of topics, on acoustics, hieroglyphs, universal language, geology, medicine, biblical studies, music, magnetism, numerology, and God knows what. Not only did he write on all these things, but he produced lavish, enormously expensive tomes, books, beautifully illustrated, spectacular texts. He had very rich patrons to pay for these editions, and therefore many of his texts had very fanciful and long dedications. Kircher is the representative of an older way of mastering the world. At a time when science, as a way of knowledge, as a new epistemological way, was being put together, Kircher represented like medieval, early Renaissance kind of knowledge. basically he wanted to make sense of the world, explaining away through symmetry and correspondence every little during the 13th and 14th centuries. Also put together one of the earliest, museums in Europe that collected countless objects brought to him from all over the world, including from China. He was a Jesuit. He never traveled to China, but he knew everybody. Everybody visited him. If they didn't know each other, they had a correspondence. So he was part of a larger network of knowledge, and it was on the basis of such information that he built his synthesis, his large-scale synthesis. How wrong was he in all his scientific endeavors? Many times fundamentally wrong. A few times some of his insights have stood the test of time. So some of the things that he talks about still makes. This is a copy of the same map from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and it is shown here in its original form. Had to explain away everything. Okay, there couldn't be anything left there without being given a reason, without being given an explanation to. We can see books. This is just a collection of covers or illustrations in his books. They are here just for your enjoyment. I won't analyze them, but basically notice how much the famous cult of the Baroque, we are in the Baroque period in European arts, the famous Baroque cult of the symmetry and of the spectacle of creating spectacular, well-ordered, symmetrical representations is obvious here. They are absolutely wonderful. You can find there's a revival in Kircher studies that has been going on for 20-30 years now, mostly since many of his texts have become. And the information is provided by means of two different pieces of text. The first one reads, "Here the Tartars were enclosed." Typical for his book, his obsession with harmony is everywhere. We can see here kind of scientific objects that he imagined. Some of them do make sense, like for instance this would be like kind of a sound amplifier that he produced, but giving access to all sorts of lost knowledge that a scholar like himself would be able to reveal anew to his contemporaries. I love the man. I do love him. He is quite a character. I don't have time to discuss every single one of them, but do take your moments at home perhaps and look at these images just for their sheer beauty. They testify to the existence of a very different world that is long gone. We don't have it anymore. In point of fact, there are people today who do Kircherize as well, but I really don't have time to go on this tangent. That would take us much too long. But you know, Kircherizing is kind of an intellectual adventure. I'm using this verb to Kircherize because scholars actually created it, right? To be a Kircher person, to treat knowledge like Kircher, therefore to Kircherize. Yeah? The verb exists. You can find it and have fun with it, right? So 400-500 years or more, look at this beautiful symmetrical representation. Look at this huge tree with a Jesuit at its root. Finally, because he wanted to have patrons, it was important for him to have rich patrons. This particular book has about, 40 dedications produced in one single language after one single language. So imagine Greek alphabet, Russian alphabet, all sorts of Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, Persian written in Arabic, whatever, Indian languages, God knows what. finally some Chinese over here, all of them one after another, dedicating the text to, I don't know, whatever, Duke, Habsburg Duke or King or whatever, right? It's basically, this tells us what? That Kircher knows all these things, right? So I know all these languages, I'm so smart. I'm going to give you truth. So pay me 600,000 kwai or something to publish this book, right? This was the kind of thing that was happening, right? He was very, very smart. And basically, he also advertised himself, right? So at the end of, I know, one publication, he wrote, as I will show in my next book, you are going to find this and that. So basically, stay tuned. My text on Egyptology is going to come up in 1 year. Then series 2 is 1644. If you pay more, then I'm going to give you one on China as well. And that's exactly what happened when he put together this compilation of knowledge about China from a source, from basically Jesuit sources, many of them, and Jesuit reports. It's a 5-part book, which is fascinating in and of itself. It exists. It was translated. It was written in Latin. It was translated into French. It was pirated. It was so popular that it was pirated by Dutch printers. So we have authorized edition and pirated editions like DVDs today. At that time, they used to pirate books. There is an English translation, partial English translation, and now there's a full English translation also available. You can have a lot of fun reading it. There are many, many parts worth our time here. Mostly, we should emphasize this part, which discusses the European experience of China, the various roads taken to China. So a review of travelers and the knowledge they brought on their way to from Europe to China. Also the curious things of China, all sorts of things that excited him and he thought they were worth commenting on, like politics, cities, mountains, animals, plants, fish, snakes, stones, and so on and so forth. This is my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful, with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse over here. Process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That would explain all sorts of historical accidents. That would explain the Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs. And we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome. And we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him and he thought they were worth commenting on. Atlas. Other examples, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse over here. The process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That would explain all sorts of historical accidents. That would explain the Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs. And we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome. And we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him and he thought they were worth commenting on, like politics, cities. Atlas. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse over here, the Heroization process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That would explain all sorts of historical accidents. That would explain the Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters derive is associated with one Fra Mauro. We can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome, and we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him, and he thought they were worth commenting on, like part of China, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That would explain all sorts of historical accidents. That would explain the Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egypt is associated with one Fra Mauro. Because we can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome, and we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him, and he thought they were worth commenting. Part of China, on like politics, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. In this section shows a page from a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels that includes this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egypt is associated with one Fra Mauro. Because we can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks and the Indies. And we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him, and he thought they were worth commenting. Part of China, on like politics, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That in this section shows a page from a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels that includes, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egypt is associated with one Fra Mauro. Because we can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, like they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks and the Indies. And we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him and he thought they were worth commenting. Part of China, on like politics, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse. Over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That in this section shows a page from a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels that includes, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egypt is associated with one Fra Mauro. Because we can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are like they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks and the Indies. And we can find the same in the actual present. Excited him and he thought they were worth commenting. Part of China, on like politics, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse. Over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That in this section shows a page from a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels that includes, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egypt is associated with one Fra Mauro. Because we can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are like they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks and the Indies. And we can find the same in the actual present. The Europeans, and he thought they were worth commenting. Part of China, on like politics, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse. Over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That in this section shows a page from a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels that includes, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egypt is associated with one Fra Mauro. Because we can easily realize that this, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are like they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks and the Indies. And we can find the same in the Europeans. In the actual present, he thought they were worth commenting. Part of China, on like politics, cities. Other examples, my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that with the devil or the beast over here, the apocalypse. Over here, region of Manji, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That in this section shows a page from a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels that tried to demonstrate this among them here, and then he uses agricultural letters that he represents like this, and all sorts of fantastic categories looking like this, with sometimes present day Tomu Pires. It failed, and Tomu Pires, you will ask yourselves, where did he get all this? And the answer is from popular encyclopedias in Ming times. Also from Buddhist texts as well, from calligraphy manuals that he got from his correspondence from Jesuit fathers who traveled to Rome and back. The way he organized them, however, is unique, wonderful, completely crazy, and that smooth relations became almost impossible. Contains things that like defeat the mind. For example, he says he reproduces series number 16, which should be over here, and then he says these are characters that cannot be read, but I'm just reproducing them because they belong to the old category. Okay, all this Tomu Pires' embassy, fascinating, completely strange, wonderful, and influential. And the influence of all this would be found in the way that would-be Chinese characters, so things like this or like this, notice that this would be made of ducks or prints of birds' feet or birds' wings or whatever. So this kind of Chinese looking characters will be found on decorative Tomu Pires by the name of Cristóvão Vieira and Vasco Calvo. Paper and furniture and plates and all the many other objects that will become very, very common in the 18th century that we will refer to next week as chinoiserie, as objects belonging to the larger category of chinoiserie objects. This continues with this image of the way of writing, and scholars have discussed a great deal about the presence of the little monkey over here. I'm not going to tell you all this because we don't have time. Also, notice his final beautiful speculation when he tries to find the difference between, well, Chinese characters and Egyptian characters. So in the first part, he has demonstrated that demonstrated how look at derive from these. Okay, this is the first part. The second part is to say, okay, fine, how do these old things connect to Egyptian hieroglyphs? Well, on the one hand, for instance, both the Egyptians and the Chinese respected the cross very, very much. So they share a common understanding of Godhead without having the vocabulary, for instance, for it. He can demonstrate this by showing the Chinese character for 10. Okay. Then he notices, he adapts a point made by Semedu, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, about how Chinese characters get composed. And you can find